Hey there, my name is Alexis, and for this video, I wanted to talk about my latest build, which was a corner TV stand that I made for my parents. And I wanted to talk about it in that video, but that video was already too long, and it would have felt out of place because I'm not really talking at all in that video. So that's why I'm making this video here. And for that TV stand, I gave it a hexagonal shape, so it has 6 sides. The front and back are open, and they have 2 plywood walls on either side. And those plywood walls have an angle of about 122 degrees. And I didn't want to do miters for this project this time because in my previous projects where I've done miters, it was very tedious to be consistent with my cuts. And I didn't like the cleanup that was involved after every glue up just because I got a lot of tear out. So just my technique and maybe my tool set just wasn't good enough for mitered corners. So I wanted to look for an alternative, which got me looking into the concept of edge banding. And if you don't know what edge banding is, that's where you take a strip of hardwood and you glue it to the edge of plywood to protect the plywood from getting chipped and giving it a much stronger edge, and also looks a lot nicer. And I took that concept and I glued 2 separate pieces of plywood to the same hardwood piece, and now that hardwood piece is the corner of whatever structure you're making. I refer to it as corner edge banding because the only other person I've seen that have called it that, and the only person I've seen online that has done corner edge banding has been Tamar from 3x3 Custom. She made a record player stand using corner edge banding, and the reason she did it was so that she can achieve a large roundover on her corners. And since she was using plywood walls, it wouldn't have worked had she done a conventional mitered corner because the plywood would have been exposed. So that was her reasoning for it. Mine is more for convenience. I didn't want to go through the frustrations of doing miters and trying to have some clean miters. And I feel like this method might be just as good, if not better, which got me into wanting to talk about this video, discussing the pros and cons. I also have these 2 test pieces here. I want to give it a stress test. I want to just have it on this corner and step on it and see which one snaps first. I feel like this is going to snap before the corner edge banding, but we'll see in a bit. But before I talk about this, let's just cut to me making these, just in case someone that's not familiar with miter corners or edge banding can just see how it's done, and then we can cut back to me now discussing this. So to test out the strength of miter corners versus corner edge banding, I got these 4 strips of Baltic birch plywood from a previous project, and they're all equal lengths and widths. They're about 3¼ inches wide by 11½ inches long, and these 2 pieces are going to receive 45-degree miters, while these 2 will receive corner edge banding using the scrap red oak hardwood that I have. So since these pieces are much smaller, I'm using the miter saw to cut everything here. But in a real life application, you would be using something like a circular saw or a table saw to make your corner edge banding or making your miter cuts. But since it's just for testing purposes, everything will be done on the miter saw. And to make sure this is as strong as possible, I went a little bit heavy with the glue just to make sure that there's a proper bond with the glue up, hopefully. And to hold everything in place, I'm using these 90-degree corner clamps by Bessey to make sure everything is 90 degrees. And for the edge banding, I went a little heavy with the glue as well, and then I used these Rockler Bandy clamps that are made for applying edge banding, but you can also just use a regular clamp, or you can also just use your hands and just apply a bit of pressure and then use masking tape to hold it while the glue cures. I would definitely recommend that for just general edge banding, but for corner edge banding, I would definitely use clamps in this situation. Alright, I left this in the boiler room overnight, and it's like 80 degrees in there, so this should have cured well. Just to make it fair, I'm going to cut off this little spare excess material, and to do that, I will get my flush trim saw. But normally you wouldn't do this with this type of saw. This is more for smaller, like dowels and like much shorter pieces. for something this large, you probably would have to use a planer or a router with a flush cut saw if you want to try that. I recently made a router jig that basically trims away at this material. There we go. Good enough. All right. So I can tell just by looking at this that the mitered corner test piece is probably going to fail before the corner edge banding piece, just because, as you can see here, there's a bit of a gap, which means my 45-degree miters weren't 45 degrees, even though I swear I checked. But the reason there's a gap is I used these 90-degree corner clamps to keep this 90 degrees, because I feel like in real life applications, you're prioritizing having your workpiece as square as possible over having a bit of a gap here. As long as there's decent enough glue up, you can always just reinforce this with splines or something similar. So I feel like in that aspect, corner edge banding does have a one up, because at least in this case, you're dealing with 90-degree angles here, so you're less likely to get a gap here. Obviously you still can, but the chance is much lower versus dealing with miters. With my TV stand, I didn't have to use any clamps. I used just the weight of the plywood walls to clamp it, so there wasn't really much of a gap between the plywood and the edge banding. So it may depend on the angle you're using, but I feel like using corner edge banding leaves you less likely to get a gap in your corner, meaning getting a much weaker joint. So speaking of like strong joints, we should talk about grain orientation when you're gluing wood to wood. So if you don't know, hardwood is made up of three different sides: the edge grain, the face grain, and then here at the end is called end grain. And you never want to glue end grain directly into the edge of plywood, because end grain, you can imagine end grain as a pile of straws with the openings out in this direction, or an area of pores. So when you're applying glue to end grain, those pores will suck in the glue and then reduce the strength of the glue connection. There's ways of going around this. For example, I think it's called sizing, where you basically pre-coat the end grain with glue to clog up those pores, and then you can apply glue after a minute or whatever to have a much stronger connection. But gluing edge grain or face grain will always be much stronger than gluing end grain. I'm sure there's videos online testing that theory, but that's from what I understand, you should never glue end grain to the edge of plywood or hardwood even. So when you're thinking about plywood is just a bunch of different layers of wood overlapping each other in opposite directions. So for example, this wood, this veneer here is in this direction. So the veneer in this direction is end grain, and then these wider layers of plywood are also end grain, meaning these tan natural color of wood is edge grain. So you have about 50% of the wood in this direction being end grain, and the other 50 is edge grain. Where here, if you're looking at a joint of plywood to hardwood, you have about 25% of the connection being end grain, while the remaining 75% is edge grain to edge grain, or face grain to edge grain. So in terms of just strength alone, if you're looking at a mitered corner connection, you already have about a 50% loss of strength. If you factor in the possible gaps between the mitered connections, there's an additional bit of loss there. But assuming you have a perfect mitered glue connection, let's just say there's 50% strength loss. While here you only get about let's say 25% strength loss. And then the same applies to this glue connection. So in terms of strength gained or strength lost, the miter connection is always going to have a lot less strength compared to a corner edge banding connection. Another thing to think about is also maybe the number of joints. Since we have corner edge banding connecting two different plywood pieces, you could also argue, since there's two different joints here, there's additional points of failure. So this could give miter corners maybe a one-up in that aspect, because miters only have one joint to fail on. But if that joint is weaker than these two joints, maybe they counteract each other, so maybe one is just as strong as the other. But what you should take from this is end grain is always bad to glue to anything. So you should always connect to edge grain or face grain. So I feel like in terms of strength, these joints should be stronger, but if you're thinking about a possible point of failure, you could also think that maybe since there's two joints here, there's more room to fail. So that's why I want to do the strength test, see which one fails, but I still feel like this is still stronger. But yeah, let's do the strength test and then we'll see what happens. So to be fair, both pieces are going to go one by one on this piece of plywood, just to be fair. And I'm going to use the same foot just in case I instinctively put more pressure on one foot than the other, just to be as fair as possible. And I weigh about 175, so both of these will undergo about 175 pounds of weight on it. So let's see. Gotta be extra careful. So I'm going to carefully lift my right foot while I step on this with my left. Oh, I already feel it stretching. 1, 2, 3. You know, that's what I expected. How about this one? Oh, actually, this one probably, I feel like it's gonna snap too. I feel a bit of more resistance here, but I felt a lot of flex. Oof. Let's see. 1, 2, 3. Oh yeah, this definitely held up better. When looking at each recording individually, it seems like they both break at around the same time, but if you were to put them side by side, it seems like the mitered corner test piece breaks first, but the difference is probably just by a couple hundredths of a second. If you were to look at the footage again, this one started to make noise at the 0.11 second mark, meaning it was starting to fail at that halfway point, or a little bit less than the halfway point. This one didn't make a single sound until it hit the 0.24 second mark. That means it was holding up twice as long as this one, if not more. This just tells me if it can hold out for twice as long, that means it can handle quite a good amount of weight before it actually fails, and it can hold up a lot more than this can. I don't know if that necessarily means this can hold twice as much weight, but it definitely holds a lot more than this can. It's my fault. I feel like I should have done incremental weight. I should have done maybe like 50 pounds and 75 and 100 to do a proper test, because I feel like that would definitely show how much weight this can actually handle and how much this one can't handle. I may be biased because I was hoping for this to win. I am confident that this method is definitely stronger. I was concerned that it was going to snap at these joints where the edges were meeting, and it didn't. It ended up snapping along the direction of the grain, I believe. Let me bring the camera closer. Alright, let's see if I can get a good focus on this. This is pretty good. So as you can see, it started to fail where the most pores are, or whatever line of pores or gaps meted this corner, because it broke at this because I guess it's just the weak point. So I guess the force was forcing it to break in this direction, and I guess it just lined up with this, and that's why it failed. If maybe the, I don't know if this is the grain or if this line here are the grain, because this line, there's a line perfectly perpendicular to this cut. So I don't know if those are the rings or if the rings are the grain. If anyone knows how to actually call this, leave it in the comments, because I'm not that well versed in how the grain works, if this is the grain or if it's even the grain at all. But it's following the voids here, and this void happened to just meet at this corner where a lot of the pressure is coming from. So yeah, I wish I had done a little bit better with the testing to see how much more weight this can handle, because I'm 100% confident this can handle more weight than this. That alone, yes. By how much, I'm not exactly sure, but my main concern is whether this can hold up as much as this, and this definitely can. So I feel like if I'm missing anything, let me know in the comments. If you have an explainer for this, I'm not that well versed with how wood direction and grain works and how it shows on the end grain. But yeah, let me know what that is exactly. And yeah, I think this was still a good experiment, and I probably will definitely continue doing this method over miters. I'm actually gonna be making a media console soon. I might do that for this. So if you want to see that, let me know how much you want to see it by liking this video, follow me on Instagram, or subscribe to my channel. My TV stand build video should be coming out in the next week. Thanks for watching, and take care.